You're listening to the podcast for all of the news, notes, and breakdowns for your Ohio State Buckeyes. This is Sons of the Shoe with Nick Wilson and Spencer German.
Sons of the Shoe is back. Spencer German riding solo with you this week, but we are 1 week closer to sweet, sweet college football. It is so close, guys. It's right around the corner. 3 weeks out now. We'll be getting actual college football on our TV screens and what we like to always call week 0. Week 1 comes shortly after that, as Ohio State will open things up against our brethren down the road, University of Akron, and we'll be off and running on the 2024 college football season. I am excited to be back with you with a new episode with college football on the horizon. August is always a fun time of year because you know that it's coming, and you also get the start of what we got this week, fall camp for the Ohio State Buckeyes program, which began late this week and brought some interesting storylines to the table in terms of things that we're going to talk about today, but also just in terms of what you can expect from the Buckeyes this year and some things to keep an eye on over the next couple of weeks as they sort through some things. We'll talk about all that throughout the next couple of weeks. Nick will be back next week. We actually are very excited because next week we have Alec Dietz, who covers Oregon for the USA Today, is going to join us. So we'll talk to him and get sort of this Oregon perspective on this conference, this budding rivalry between the two teams. But in the meantime, we have plenty to talk about this week. And I actually do want to start out of the gate with one of the big headlines that came out of day one of camp in terms of for Ohio State, and something specifically that Ryan Day had to say, because he was asked point blank to define what he thinks Ohio State's identity is going to be in 2024. And I thought that his answer, well, I'll read you kind of what he said here. And his answer was very, what's the right phrasing? His answer was very political, and that he didn't, it was the biggest non-answer ever is a good way to probably put it. And I get that that's kind of par for the course. Coaches will generally do that. They love to just give you a very eloquent non-answer to questions that you're asking. But I think it's a good place to start, because going into the season, I think there are a number of different ideas as to what the Ohio State identity needs to be and what people are expecting Ohio State's identity to be, or what they're expecting them to be good at this season as they embark on this journey to try to win a national championship. And they're very much in that conversation. So what he said in response to the question of what is the identity for Ohio State this year, he said, quote, "You challenge all those guys. What is your identity?" He said, "I know what I want our team identity to be. I told the team it's to be the hardest playing team in the country. When someone watches the Buckeyes this year, they should see that. What do you want yourself to be? What do you want your unit to be? What do you want the offense to be, the defense to be? Those are the challenges that we've had this summer to our staff and our players," end quote. Again, very non-political answer from Ryan Day, by just kind of leaning into the idea that he's been asking the guys, hey, what do you want our identity to be? You get to decide. This is a choose your own ending book, if you will, where you guys are the authors of your own story. And there's some truth to that, I understand. But I do think that they need to go into this season having a good sense of, and I'm sure they do, and Ryan Day just wasn't going to share it, but they need to go into the season having a good sense of like who they are, specifically on offense. Because defense, I do think Ohio State's defense, from an identity standpoint, is kind of, I don't want to say self-explanatory, because that's kind of just like a cop-out like Ryan Day gave us. But when you're dubbing yourselves like best in America and your secondary is as good as your secondary is, you got all these guys coming back, you kind of know what to expect with that group. Like, I think that the identity of the defense is like pure domination. Like, there should not be a lot of teams that they struggle with, and they should be giving you advantages in the games that you are playing tougher opponents, because your defense is supposed to be superior to most of the defenses in the sport this year. And you have just an assortment, a plethora of talent from top to bottom across this roster, specifically guys who obviously are coming back and are senior laden. Like there's going to be a lot of leadership on that side of the ball. So I actually think like from an identity standpoint with the defense, I think it kind of centers around the idea that those guys, that group specifically, and there are a lot of returners on offense too, don't get it twisted. But but with how many guys came back on defense in particular, I think the defense is kind of the calling card of this team and the thing that you fall back on when things aren't going right. Like when you need to stop, when the offense is maybe struggling a little bit, that's the group you're looking at like, okay, they got to get the job done. So I do think their identity kind of starts with that group and the leadership and the ability to in a pinch rise to the occasion and face the adversity. That's what I'm looking at with that group. And I think that can kind of set the tone then for the rest of the team, where you have some other leaders on offense that obviously returned as well. Offensive line, running back room has some upperclassmen. Will Howard being an upperclassman, you're expecting him to kind of be a leader, but he's kind of new to this whole thing. So yeah, there's some interesting elements there, but I think the defense kind of sets the tone. I think they're kind of the anchor of this team as a whole. Offensively, though, is where I think people are going to be most notably paying attention to figure or trying to pinpoint or put a finger on what they do well or what their identity is. And I think that makes a lot of sense because it's the thing that has maybe the most questions right now. Like I think many of us are going into this year feeling pretty confident in the defense, and it is going to come down to a couple different elements here or there on offense that will reserve judgment to decide if this team's a championship caliber team or not for real. And that's expected. I think they expect that. I think they understand that when you have some turnover at the quarterback position, most notably, that's going to happen. And I do want to talk at a later date with Nick just about like what area, maybe specifically on offense, you think is going to hold Ohio State back the most. But that's for a later conversation. In terms of what their identity needs to be on offense, I do think that it has to start with the running back room. And we always look back and say like, yeah, you got these great you got these great Ohio State teams over the course of history that were really good, that had really good running backs. And that's kind of Ohio State football. And in a lot of ways, like that's kind of an outdated philosophy. And you can't just, but at the same time, in the same vein, like how has Alabama oftentimes got the job done? It's often been with like a great running game and a quarterback that can do things when they need to do things and some great receivers on the outside doing it. And I think that's where it starts. Like I think the offensive identity starts with those two running backs who are two of the best in the country, and to have them as a tandem together is a scary proposition for other teams, specifically other teams in the Big Ten, to have to worry about and to have to think about. And so I do think that the run game is sort of where we start with this, but it can't just be that group. I think Ryan Day and where he has to be careful, and this goes back to why they've lost to Michigan 3 years in a row. And this is also like, this is maybe where we pivot the conversation to in a more like an overarching whole team identity standpoint, because there's the offensive identity, there's the defensive identity. I think the defense sets the tone for what this group is going to be. How tough they're going to be is a word that Ryan Day obviously likes to throw around, and he used the phrasing of like the hardest working team in the country. I think when he says something like that, I do think there's some meaning in terms of not just resting on your laurels. And I think that starts with the defense being the group that's even though they're as talented as they are, not just going out there thinking that they're going to just destroy everybody. Like it definitely starts with them in some capacity. So that's what I mean by that. But from an overarching standpoint, like I think Ryan Day does have to be careful not to get too in. And I know he's not calling the plays this year. I know he's passing it off to Chip Kelly, but I think he has to be careful not to get too in his own way or in his own head about being something specific on offense that maybe this team isn't. And that's not to say like in the past he hasn't always gotten that right, because I think there's times where he didn't. Like we always look back and say, why didn't he use CJ Stroud as a runner more? Like I think that he was so dead set on, well, I'm going to make CJ Stroud this pocket passer, and that's what we're going to do. That he maybe neglected that part of his game. And then we saw in the Georgia matchup in the playoff that was actually an effective tool for this team and for this offense. And it was mind-boggling that he didn't tap into it sooner. And it could have been something that helps you maybe beat a Michigan that year. You never know. So I like that. That's something I think you look back on. And I do think there's some element of like Ryan Day just kind of wanting to like be right about the guy he has at quarterback at the time, or be right about the offense that he has kind of put together and the talent that's on it. And I'm not saying that there's this unit is no slouch. Like Jeremiah Smith, another thing Ryan Day talked about on day one of camp was kind of tempering expectations for him. They're not naming him a starter or anything crazy like that at this time, but it's the writing's kind of on the wall that he will be. And so, like, yeah, you got to use those weapons. I'm not saying not to, but I think he has to be careful to not fall into this trap that he has in previous years where he's like, we're just going to finesse our way to wins all the time and go away from the run game and go away from this team that could be really, really good in that area because of the two guys that they have back there and an offensive line that still has questions. And again, we'll talk about that at a later date in terms of if that being maybe something that holds this team back. But they're a year older. There's some guys in there on that front line that you should be able to trust a little bit more this year. And you got to feel good about the fact that these guys running behind them are also going to make up for some mistakes here or there that they might make up front because they're that good. But I think that the identity does have to start with having this great run game that takes some pressure off of Will Howard, who is a good running quarterback in his own right, but so that it's not like all on him to make these big throws, because that's the other area right now that I have questions about. We talk about the offensive line. I think there are some questions with Will Howard. I have been, I've planted the flag earlier this offseason about him being a good fit and how I think it's going to work and how I think he's a good quarterback. And I certainly think he's an upgrade from Kyle McCord, but there are still some questions there about, like, does he have that big gamer ability? Is he going to, in crunch time of a big game, like against Oregon or something, is he going to deliver in those spots? Like there is some of that to think about with him. And I think you alleviate some of that by having a really good run game and tapping into those two weapons that are going to be in the backfield with him and utilizing them in an effective way. And maybe some of that too is getting Caleb Downs involved. I know during spring ball, there was some usage of him coming out of the backfield. And so that seems like a tool that they're going to use or have at their disposal as well. But I do think, yeah, like the identity on offense does start with those two guys. And then it kind of rolls out from there with Will Howard being able to be comfortable, make the throws downfield, utilize these weapons. But if you just turn this into well, hey, let's just air it out and gun it up and down the field and finesse our way to victories again, I think that's going to be, again, maybe the downfall of Ryan Day like it's been in previous years, where then you lose to a Michigan or you lose to some of these other teams, and and you're sitting there licking your wounds and maybe looking for a job at the end of the season. So I think he has to be careful not to fall into that trap. I also think too, though, as much as, like, if you lean into that run game, I think the idea that Ohio State would be tough again, because this is the thing we've tapped into, right, with the Michigan losses, has been, well, Michigan was the tougher team. They were built to win in the Big Ten, and they weren't this finesse team like Ohio State was. Ohio State was a Ferrari. They were like a Ford F-150 or whatever you wanted to say for Michigan, whatever you wanted to say they were. And Ohio State has to be able to win both ways. And so you can't fall into the trap, though. I think, like, I think Ryan Day sometimes has a tendency of getting in his head with this stuff, where he like overthinks it. And he's like, well, this year's going to be the year we do this, or this year's. And I think that was on display last year. You get the rant after the Notre Dame game about my team is tough and blah, 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 blah. I'd like to know where Lou Holtz is right now, as we all remember. And I found that moment very amusing and still do. And I use that meme all the time. But I also, like, I think that was him showing us that he gets in his head sometimes about, I need to prove that my team's tough. I need to prove that my team is this. I need to prove that my team is that. And so he can't fall into that trap of trying to prove everybody wrong and be like, well, I need to prove that my team's tougher, so I'm going to do this, that, and the third to accomplish these things and prove that we are better than Michigan this year. He just has to kind of let it take care of itself. And I think if they lean into that run game being the focal point, they lean into that run game being the identity on offense as sort of the starting point, because you have two really good backs who are upperclassmen that you feel like you can rely on and trust, the rest will kind of take care of itself. And I think you can kind of build things from there. And I do think Chip Kelly alleviates a little bit of that as well. He's always tended to have really good running teams. He made UCLA a really good running team his several years that he was there. So I think if that's your starting point, if that's your identity, and I do think Ohio State fans can wrap their minds around that and get on board with that, because, again, we love to reference the glory days of Ohio State where running was kind of the bread and butter of the offense and of the team. I think that's an easy sell to fans as well. But I do think it starts there and kind of then, balloons out to other areas on that side of the ball. And I think if it'll take care of the other things will take care of themselves if you let that be the starting point. The conversations about being tough enough, the conversations about not being able to beat Michigan, like that stuff will come if you prove that you can win that way. And I think that's the thing that's kind of hanging over Ryan Day at this point. And he has to avoid, again, falling into the trap of just like trying to go out and do things to prove people wrong and just, coach his team the right way and let them win games the way that they should be able to and that they know how, because they're a super, super talented team. What do you think is the identity of Ohio State, or what do you think should be the identity of Ohio State this year? Because Ryan Day gave you a big nothing burger of an answer. He said he wants to prove that they're the hardest working team in the country. That's coach speak. That's not an answer in terms of what their identity needs to be. But I want to know from the fan perspective, what do you think it should be? What will it be in 2024, which is a couple of weeks away now from actually getting rolling? We got college football on the horizon. I do appreciate you guys jumping in. It's Sons of the Shoe. We are a relatively new podcast, coming up on a year since we started this thing in October. So I implore you to like, subscribe, follow, whatever you do with however you interact with your podcast in the Odyssey app, at Apple Podcasts, at 922thefan.com, and the 92 the Fan YouTube channel. Did I mention Apple Podcasts? Well, I'm going to mention it again, and I hope you'll find us there. When we get back, guys, a potential punishment for that team up north coming a year after the fact. We'll talk about that and what it means and why, whether or not I'm on board with this coming down now or not, based off of the sign stealing scandal. And of course, later in the show, we'll get you 4 down territory. It's Spencer German with you on the latest episode of Sons of the Shoe. Keep it locked. Here's a quick word from our sponsors, and we'll talk to you on the other side.